Okay, hi everyone. Lovely to have you all here. For those that I haven't met before, I'm Anita Tang, Community Organising Director at Centre for Australian Progress, and delighted to be hosting this first in a series of new webinars around lessons in organising. Partly, we're always looking for ways to build our ambition, our capacity and our excitement around community organising. And there are so many exciting things happening around Australia and around the globe at the moment in organising. And one of the big advantages actually of having shifted things to online over the last 8 months is it's much easier now to gather together like this, have an hour where we can step back from our usual work, think bigger. I like to talk about looking up and out as a way of refreshing ourselves. So this is the first in a series of webinars that will help us do that. And hopefully at the end of this hour and the other hours that you join us, we will leave feeling inspired and with some new ideas, and also feeling solidarity with however many people. So there are 58, the counter keeps moving, but we've probably got about 60 people together in the Zoom room who all come together because we care about organising, we want to build power, and we want to win on the things that matter to us and the people that we represent or the constituencies that we're part of. So as you probably know from the announcement about the plan for today, our original plan was to focus on 2 things today. One was about First Nations organising in the Northern Territory election, and the other as a bit of a moment for us to come together and share our feelings, insights and ideas following the US election results. Unfortunately, Rhys is not able to join us today. So her session's been rescheduled. It means that we will spend the entire hour today thinking about the US election, which is fabulous. So before I go any further though, I want to acknowledge country. I want to thank all of you for introducing yourselves in the chat and saying what country you're from. And so I'm joining from Gadigal land. And this week in particular, I think for NAIDOC week, the theme around always was, always will be, which often we talk about in terms of custodianship of the land and remembering that sovereignty was never ceded and that we are all living and working on stolen land. The other things that it prompts me to think about is the continuation of culture and language, and also the strength of First Nations resistance. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves that despite all the things that are happening, First Nations are creating and continuing powerful movements and continuing and creating pride in culture and community. And that those of us who are not from First Nations communities should be doing whatever we can to lend our resources, our privilege and our solidarity to that fight. So just want to acknowledge that. So the plan for this hour is that we are going to hear from Luke Hilakari, who's joining us from Vic Trades Hall, to share his reflections. He's been obviously, like many of us, closely observing what's happening in the US, but I've asked him to particularly share some highlights in terms of organising lessons and insights to help us think about what that might mean for us. But before we do that, because there are so many fabulous people in this room, almost 70 of us now, some of you know each other and some are what I would consider connections to be made. So we are going to break into pairs so that you can have a chat to somebody else. And this is partly the emotional debrief part of the debrief, because it was a pretty roller coaster ride there around the US election. So maybe just touch base with the person you get paired up with to go, how are you feeling about things now? What are you worried about, if anything still? And what are you most hopeful about since the US election? So Jess, if you'd like to open up those breakouts. And this is a very quick conversation, 5 minutes, and then we'll pull you back into plenary and hear from Luke. Fantastic, great to have everyone back. Thank you. I hope you all either had a chance to reconnect with someone you already know or to meet somebody new, because that's always exciting. So we are going to move now to talking about the US election with a sort of discussion starter and some observations from Luke. So a couple of things I want to say is, we are focusing on the US election, not only because the outcome of that election reverberates around the world and affects us all in different ways, but actually in this context, what we want to do is think about what lessons are there from the organising that happened there. So this won't be so much around an analysis of the way the votes fell, but actually what are some of the highlights around organising that might have some implications for us as we prepare for our own election next year and for building power generally. So Luke may not need a lot of introduction, but perhaps just to remind people that Luke is the Secretary of the Victorian Trades Hall Council, peak body for unions in Victoria, also on the board of Centre for Australian Progress. And last year, Luke and I were both on the US study tour. Seems like a lifetime ago now, but in the middle of 2019, we spent 4 weeks in the US meeting with some of the most exciting and interesting organisations doing organising and campaigning there. And so I've asked Luke to share his insights and sort of like highlights, I guess, the bright moments of organising in the lead up to the US election and what he thinks that might mean for us. So Luke, I'm going to throw over to you.
Thank you, comrades. Welcome everybody. Good to see so many progressive sisters and brothers with us today. It's excellent. Can I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land? I'm meeting in the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I want to pay my deep respects to their elders, both past and present, and those Aboriginal people that we might have with us today online. Good to see you all, especially in NAIDOC week. I'm excited to do this presentation, so thank you to Anita and Australian Progress. I'll talk for about 10 minutes. There's a lot to get through, so I'm going to probably move pretty quickly. What I'm not going to do today is to go into like individual counties and numbers and all that type of stuff. I think everyone on this hookup is more than capable of doing that. And I think some of us, and I had a good chat with Kate, who was my partner, I think we all have a little bit of US election fatigue. I don't know about all of you, but I was waking up sort of every 3 hours just to check how the count in Pennsylvania was going and how the count in Michigan was going. And yeah, so I think a lot of us are feeling that. And a lot of us are also surprised about Trump can still get 70 million votes for the last 4 years. And that's hitting home. So what we thought we'd do is we talk about some of the really great progressive achievements and highlights to give us a sense of what's possible for us. So I want to talk about 2 different campaigns. I want to talk about Stacey Abrams. I'm going to give you a bit of introduction about her and what she's been doing. And then I want to talk about a union effort with Unite Here and the SEIU. So I'm going to start with Stacey. So Stacey Abrams, I think without a doubt, had the most significant campaign that had just an unbelievably huge impact on the state of Georgia. For those who don't know her, and I know a lot of you probably already do, she's a progressive Black woman. She's a lawyer, she's an activist. She also writes romance novels in her spare time because, you know, everyone needs a hobby, and that's sort of really cool. She ran for governor in 2018, and she ran for governor of the state of Georgia and lost by 55,000 votes. And she did a fair bit of thinking over a reasonably long period of time about why she lost. And in the state of Georgia, voting suppression is a real thing. And by suppression in that state, it looks like a couple of things. It looks like people having to wait 4 hours in lines to vote. It looks like 100,000 people being removed from the voters' rolls. It looks like 48 hours before the polls start, that they move the polling places so people don't know where to go. So like, it's really nasty stuff. And so she started 2 campaign groups. The first group she called was Fair Fight, and the second group she called was the New Georgia Project. The Fair Fight Project was all about how do we make elections fair? How do we get over voter suppression? And the second project, which I think is super interesting, which I think you all need to spend some time looking at, is the New Georgia Project. Her theory of change was, I don't want to spend a lot of time persuading a lot of what in her view was white, sort of middle class, working class voters to vote a particular way. Her strategy was actually what we need to do is get a whole lot of young people and people of colour to enrol to vote. We need to expand the field dramatically so. Her efforts and that team's efforts put over 800,000 people on the roll, like 800,000. then this wasn't a short-term project. This is a project that took her 7 years, but 800,000 people on the roll is why they won. Absolutely why they're going to win Georgia. What's also important to Georgia, for all you election geeks out there like me, you'll know they'll have 2 runoff elections as well. The runoff elections are really interesting. The runoff elections are going to be to determine really who will control the Senate, and both of them are happening in Georgia. So those 800,000 people are going to make an absolute huge difference. But the strategy was more than just registering people. It was to create what they were terming as in like super voters. They wanted people to have voter education. They wanted people to have good mobilisation. They wanted to be confident, informed voters. They wanted voters that will not just be here and show up for one election because they like the candidate. They wanted voters that would be there for every election to turn like that state into a super progressive state. Now, the state hasn't been called yet, but as of last night, they were up by 14,000 votes, which is great. But yeah, keep your eyes out on what Stacey does next for the Senate election, which will happen on January 5. Yeah, her campaign is super smart. Basically, if you looked at some, not election numbers, but raw numbers, when she started their campaign in 2012, there were 3.9 million people registered to vote. By the time she was done, there was 4.95 million people registered to vote in Georgia. An amazing campaign. Spent a lot of time looking at that. The other campaign I liked was the efforts of the SEIU and Unite Here. These are 2 unions that represent really the emerging working class. I know when people think of working class, like your immediate thoughts go, you know, it's a white guy, probably in his 40s, you know, one of the Rust Belt states. That ain't what the working class is anymore, especially if you look at these 2 unions. If you look at Unite Here, white people make up only 10% of that workforce. Unite Here represents culinary workers, and especially strong in a state like Nevada, where they have 60,000 members. So Nevada, you know, Las Vegas, gambling city, huge impact by COVID. So 90% of that workforce had been stood down. A lot of people really suffering. Nevada also was impacted by the fires from California. So the smoke came across into that state. Nevada is also a funny state because it's also an open carry state. And by open carry, I don't mean open carry like a bottle of whiskey, I mean open carry a gun. And so people can walk around shops with something in your holster, which is quite an interesting challenge when you're thinking about door knocking. So the interesting thing that these 2 unions did is they made a separate decision from the Democratic Party to continue to door knock. So the SEIU continued to do door knocking in both Michigan and Wisconsin. In both those seats, they knocked up to 155,000 doors. Unite Here knocked over 575,000 doors in Philadelphia alone. Like, they were having lots and lots of conversations when basically no one else was in the field doing that. I think this was super important because they had a theory of change that sat behind it. So they wanted to have a conversation with every single person, but trying to do it in a COVID safe way, which puts an extra barrier on. So when they would knock on a door, they would stand 6 feet back. If that person wasn't wearing a mask, they would ask that person to wear a mask. If they didn't have a mask, they would give that person a mask, and then they would have a conversation. Funny enough, they found that even asking someone to wear a mask wasn't really the barrier. And then they would enter into what is sort of like a Marshall Gantt sort of conversation. So what they wanted to do is tell a personal story and really connect with that voter for a small amount of time and hear about their personal story and use that as a mechanism to talk about shared common values and turning those people out to vote. I think that is a super impressive effort. Like when we're thinking about how difficult COVID was in a state like Nevada, where you had like 90% of the people no longer working, what that meant is there was actually quite a lot of union volunteers that were looking for something to do. And in a town where, you know, most of the population is furloughed, having a conversation about how your state should be actually made a big difference. So what should healthcare feel like right now? Well, healthcare could never be a bigger conversation than what was currently happening to them. What should the environment look like when you could look out your window and no longer see the mountains because everything's covered in smoke? So I thought them continuing to do old-fashioned door knocking in, with a theory of change that sits around some of the GAN's education, I thought was super smart and impressive. So that's the second campaign I would spend some time looking at. I think both those campaigns had major impacts. So one campaign really focused on how do we register people to vote and how do we make them super voters? How do we get them rusted on with us for life? And the other campaign was, all right, well, let's see how we can continue to persuade folk. And what does that look like in a challenging time like now? So Anita, I think that's pretty close to my 10 minutes. And I reckon these are the two superstar things to check out. So if you're part of the union movement and want to be part of the union movement, like reaching out to your colleagues at the SEIU or Unite Here would be a great thing to do. And I reckon everyone should keep their eye on what's going to happen in Georgia come January 5.
Great, thank you, Luke. Great examples to point out and for people to look at if they haven't already. So what we're going to do now, just for a few minutes, and I should flag Luke needs to leave at a little after 12:30. I'm going to keep you for a few minutes, Luke, if that's all right. If people have questions that they want to ask Luke about those examples, perhaps pop them in the chat. I want to tease out with you, Luke, your thinking around the implications for us here, because obviously the dynamics and the process of elections are very different there. But in terms of the organising and the strategy, what are you taking from that for us to think about here, like either for the union movement or more broadly for civil society?
Yeah, I think so we have had the advantage, right, that we don't really have to do turnout, okay? So we can put some of that voter registration aside. I don't think totally. I think there are lessons we can take away that for when young people aren't enrolled to vote. So I think that's super important to start thinking, well, what does that work look like at universities? What does that work look like when someone's turning 18, is in high school and getting involved in our movements? What does that conversation look like? I think that's super important. The stuff that I think we can take away from here is still, what does our field campaign look like? So when we're going to election, how are we knocking on doors? How are we having conversations? And how are we measuring whether or not we are having success? Not to knock anybody who's wobbled board before on election, but how do we sort of count that as something as persuasive, and that amount of time doing that to cars that are honking your horns, as opposed to being at someone's residence and having a meaningful connection with somebody else? And then how do we make sure that connection means that someone's going to vote with really good progressive values?
Great. Both those case studies you talked about had amazing levels of ambition in terms of the numbers. What do you think stands in our way here about what stops us having that level of ambition, or what would it take for us to be able to reach that sort of scale?
I think it needs a new sense of coordination amongst all ourselves, right? So we still tend to organise in our own hubs around our own sort of visions rather than the greater collective vision. I think if we, as a big group, decide to come together and said, all right, these are things we believe in, this is what we want to achieve, and make them really ambitious. It's also, funny enough, I think people will be more willing to go out there and put more time and resources in if we had a federal leadership that responded to the things we cared about. Like seeing yesterday, like the cuts to the New Start allowances, that's just heartbreaking. And not seeing a strong enough response by progressive collective leaders, I think like that's dampening people's enthusiasm, I think.
Yeah, okay. There's a question in the chat from Kath. Kath, do you want to unmute? Because I'm not sure that I'll interpret it correctly, but you're asking about how it differs to Indi and what's different to door knocking so far here for progressives.
Oh, yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for the talk. And I've really appreciated hearing the lessons. And at Progress and other places, I've heard Kathy McGowan and the other crew at Indi talking about how they spent sort of years building up the electorate and getting people involved in voting and in becoming volunteers for their for their campaign. And I was just wondering here, I guess a lot of whatever talk we've been talking for years about doing a personal story and working out our values, whether door knocking or what other conversations we've been having. So is this just validating that, or is it different in some way?
Thanks, Kath.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, actually, Kath. I think you're right. It does validate that some of these techniques still hold true, and having a one-on-one conversation is the most effective way to move someone to take an action. I think that's right. I think there's also something in what the culinary workers were doing, which was like being in their own communities. So a Latinx person talking to a Latinx worker, that makes a lot of sense because it comes from a shared space and community. So like when we're doing our door knocking at Trades Hall, we might go into an area that we know cares deeply about healthcare. We would have nurses door knocking then. Everyone opens a door to a nurse or a firefighter or something like that, but then they can have a really detailed conversation about something they care about. And it might be actually quite personal, but with someone they trust. It's a trusted profession. I think there was a conversation that maybe I had with my one-on-one partner, Kate, who was talking about how politicians aren't trusted anymore. So when it comes to things like healthcare or education or climate change, people who are in those fields doing those work, they're the authorities in that space. And we should be leveraging that to make sure we get good political outcomes.
Great, thanks. And there's a question in the chat from Ricky about what's the key lesson for progressive campaigning when the left of centre party or candidate isn't all that progressive?
Yeah, I reckon that's a great question. And I had that in my head before we came here, and I was thinking about Biden and is he like not super progressive? Because there was some really interesting policy stuff that made me feel like actually he was a little bit more progressive than what we either didn't give him credit for or weren't properly watching. Like you're thinking about free childcare and free kindergarten, like that is something we desperately want. Like free childcare in Australia would mean that a whole lot of women would be able to have options about going to work and would free up a burden that is being unfairly placed with them in the private sphere. There are some really interesting policies about raising the minimum wage. So there was more progressive stuff, I think, in there that I agree with you. Like we didn't hear it. I don't know if that's because we're from Australia and we weren't the right audience, we weren't picking it up, or maybe Biden thought he could cruise through without articulating some of those things. But you know, what do you do with a centre left party? Like my view is I push them more to the left. That's what I think we should be doing.
And Danny's got a question. We'll have to make this the last one, I think, Luke, because I know you have another meeting to go to. But how better coordinated with non-political party or candidate campaigns this time compared to 2016? Do you have an observation?
I think I know Danny. Hello, Danny. And I've done some coordinated campaigning with him in Victoria. I think this Danny, I know. I think they were much better, actually. I think what happened in 2016, which I think you probably all validate, is that the Hillary Clinton Democratic machine said, basically, we got this, guys, and leave it to us. I think we saw civil society, especially what had been going on in America, start to really stand up and get together. Like the Black Lives Matter movement, like what an amazing movement to start with, but the way in which they dominated the public narrative and turned that into action. Like Biden would not be elected right now if it wasn't for the black population, especially black women and women like Stacey Abrams who are leading the charge. So I think civil society made a really big difference. And Nita, we saw a bit of that developed when we went over there. Like the Organising Corps and concepts like that, I thought were really smart. What was your thoughts on Nita?
They were really thinking about it already. So for those who aren't familiar, Organising Corps was this concept that came out of, I think, the very harsh lessons of the loss in 2016. And I think, Luke, you just made the point about the importance of organising in communities with people from those communities rather than people who are swarming into a marginal seat at the last minute. So Organising Corps was all about how do we identify potential leaders and organisers from the highly affected communities that are going to make a difference. How do we train them in advance and guarantee them a job? And it's a really exciting concept, and it flips on its head the idea that we have people who are paid to be organisers who we then allocate out to the places where we want to organise to go, where are the places we want to organise, and how do we find the people who are already part of that community and train them up and give them work as organisers.
And they were trained, what, 2 years in advance? Like, at least were? Like,
and the other very savvy thing was actually targeting people in their second last year of college, so that they knew that they would be trained now, they'd have another year of college, and when they graduated, it was actually when they needed a job, and guaranteeing them a job at that point, so that they were ready to roll and they weren't going to be taken away by some other job in the meantime.
Yeah, I thought that was really savvy, and I'm sure that made a massive difference. Like, I've gone to other seats in other states before, and you do feel like a blow-in, and, you know, and they know it too. The voters know it. Like, you know.
Yeah, it was amazing. So, Luke, just before we let you go, what would be your final word to this group of people who have all come because we all care about organising and we want to build power and we have an eye to the next election here? What's, if anything, what's your call to action?
So, comrades, I think this is giving us renewed power and energy. We should really look at these lessons and say, how can we collaborate to make massive change? We should not be small in our ambitions. We should reach for really hard stuff, because as a giant collective, we can get this done. So, comrades, I really appreciate you spending some time listening to me, asking to some amazing questions. I'll look forward to organising with you all in the future. And thanks, Anita and Australia Progress.
Thanks, comrade. See you. Everyone else, we have a chance to keep thinking this through together. Thank you, Luke, so much. Take care. The last thing I'd like to say before we close is that we also have just a really quick survey, which we'll chuck in the chat. Would love feedback on this because it's our first one. You know, what you thought worked, what you thought we should think about changing for future webinars, anything like that, which is great. So that's in the chat, so you could open it and maybe fill it out later if you don't get to it in the next minute. And then maybe just to finish, if you want to chuck into the chat one word for how you're feeling at the end of the hour as a result of being here, would be fantastic. And I think Fong's saying, great, excellent, thank you, Fong. Oh, lovely. Great, excellent. And hopefully, while we're calling them a series and you could register for all of them together or just come to the ones that interest you, looking forward to seeing your faces again at future ones of these. And hopefully next time when we do the mix and mingles and breakouts, you'll get to meet more amazing connections and share your experiences and insights. And we'll keep building on our collective knowledge and excitement about organising. So thank you so much for joining us today. Lovely to see so many of you. And we'll see you next time. Take care. You can unmute yourselves to say goodbye. So I suppose
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.